Olá a todos e a todas, meu nome é Renato Morgado, eu sou coordenador de integridade socioambiental da Transparência Internacional do Brasil. Gostaria de dar as boas-vindas a todos vocês e pedir desculpas pelo pequeno atraso, que faz parte desse segundo digital. Essa é a segunda edição do Diálogos à Frente da Curva. Essa é a segunda edição do Diálogos à Frente da Curva, uma iniciativa da Transparência Internacional que agora conta com a importante parceria.
Fernando, está picotando em inglês. Está picotando em inglês.
A parceria do Michael em nome
no Zoom está picotando.
E a proposta do Diálogos à Frente da Curva é discutir os grandes desafios atuais e como esses desafios se projetam no mundo pós-pandemia. No dia de hoje, a gente vai discutir a conexão entre temas que geralmente são debatidos de forma separada. Por um lado, o desafio da prevenção e do combate à corrupção, por outro, os desafios relacionados a clima e meio ambiente. São desafios debatidos em fóruns, por órgãos e por grupos da sociedade e do Estado que fazem essa discussão de forma separada. Porém, são temas com múltiplas conexões, e a ideia nossa é discutir essas conexões de como a corrupção ela acaba sendo um elemento muito presente em ações e em decisões que acabam provocando degradação ambiental, emissões de gases de efeito estufa e muitas vezes dificuldades de uma transição climática
into a better world, mitigating issues for climate change. We will have a very complete debate here, and I would like to thank our speakers for being with us. Minister Marina Silva, Minister Herman Benjamin, Anna Cavazzini from the European Parliament, and former member of the UN Environment Program and Minister of the Environment in Germany, Mr. Klaus Töpfer. So good morning, and I give the floor to Michelle Westland, who will greet us on the behalf of the German Embassy.
To compare approaches to common challenges adopted in other regions of the world, and to discuss lessons for the future. And it is with this in mind that I'm looking forward to today's debate, which will bring together a Brazilian perspective, a German perspective, a European Union perspective, and a United Nations perspective, and which will draw on experience in government, in parliament, in the judiciary, and in international organizations. With this, I pass on the floor to our distinguished moderator, Ana Carolina Amaral, which will introduce our high-level panel and moderate today's event. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Obrigada. Vou falar em português, então.
Thank you very much. I will be speaking in Portuguese. For those who are watching the webinar, you have the interpretation option. I am Ana Carolina Amaral from the Folha de São Paulo newspaper. Very honored to be here, as Renato Morgado has already mentioned. And when we pick up the thread of corruption, we understand the web that connects environmental and climate change aspects from the dichotomies of development and environmental development, but also the trend to violate individual rights, damaging the environment. And I am sure that this dialogue will occur here very strongly. We will have a first round that will last 10 to 15 minutes for each speaker. And after that, we have a series of questions that have been prepared by our team. And finally, we will open for the public to send their questions. We will certainly have time to entertain them. I would like to begin by giving the floor to Minister Marina Silva, former Environment Minister between 2003 and 2008, and she was also a congresswoman after that, and also a senator for her state, Acre. She is a historian, a pedagogue, and she has been a candidate for the presidency in 3 elections. Minister, when you have 5 minutes to go, I will warn you. Thank you very much. Please open your microphone, Minister Silva. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to thank you for the invitation. I am honored to be here next to people like Anna Cavazzini from the European Parliament, Mr. Klaus Töpfer. When I was the minister, we had the opportunity to meet and to work together. You and to Ana Carolina, our moderator, and our dear Justice Herman Benjamin from the Superior Court. I believe that the aspects that were raised for my 15-minute talk, where I include some aspects that should be weaved here, such as, for instance, the relationship between corruption and its connections to climate change and environmental degradation, and to how it impacts the indigenous peoples, and problems like the pandemic, and also the agenda for mitigation and adjustment. What are the evils that corruption ultimately brings to the climate agenda and to environmental preservation? This is not simple, and I am not an expert, but I will give you my perspective and my experience. I believe we must see corruption in different levels. We have the more direct and easily perceptible level, which is embezzlement of public money to be used for something other than its purpose and the law. In my opinion, there are also other forms of corruption that also hinder the for environmental protection and for the preservation of life on our planet, because ultimately this is what happens when we deal with serious issues such as climate change. I would say there is one form of corruption, which is the one that exactly corrupts the character of our very existence in the world, which is the possibility to mediate political interests and ethics. Ricardo Goldenberg, a psychoanalyst from Argentina, says that all politics take place within the limits of the law, because the law is nothing but interdicting the ownership of something. When we think about the products and the goods that we buy and that we produce in general, but also when we think of natural goods, those that follow specific natural laws that when corrupted will damage life in general. This is another form of corruption. Today, I would say that the greed that has been destroying natural resources for profit is a form of this corruption, of not taking into consideration the presence of others, the existence of others, not others who are next to us, but also others in the future, others that still have not been born. When you have a corrupted attitude towards the society, which will not enable the enjoyment of a good because you do not take into account the existence of the other. This is a deeper level, and to me, it is at the basis of all other problems related to not respecting the limits of what must be used by me and by others. And as I said, there is the form of corruption, and I'm sure Justice Herman and Mr. Töpfer and others are experts in that, but it is a form of corruption that seeks undue benefits outside of the legality of the law over public and private spaces. When we think about corruption, it is very easy to think about the money that did not go to schools or to health and that was used for other purposes, as we see in our country very recently with all the thefts of money that took place from the health area. So the money that was supposed to be used to protect the environment is also corrupted. But there is a form of corruption that is not visible. When you say they use that money that was supposed to go to a school, to a road, people are clear about that, but people are not so clear about the natural goods of a society or of an ethnical group. There is the equity of the people, which are their financial assets, their public assets, but there are also the natural assets. When I think about the different Brazilian environments, the rainforest, the plains areas, I am thinking about the Brazilian population and the natural basis for our development. And here corruption is not so clear because corruption is not doing what the law defines to protect these assets that belong to society and that nobody can dispose of absolutely just to meet their own individual profits or benefits. So when I think about the idea of corruption, I see the following. Occupying an area to extract wood and timber for squatting, for illegal use of a good that provides natural ecological services is a form of corruption. We are usually very frightened in Brazil with what we have been accustomed to calling the petroleum corruption, but now we have a very serious forest corruption, which is the illegal squatting in public lands in the expectation that they will be regulated, benefiting the criminals that occupy that land. So we have 2 times a loss, environmental and economic, to our public assets. We have the fires in the Pantanal region, and this coincides with a series of processes that took place, which are also a form of corruption that damages what our laws define with regards to protecting those assets and products and goods. When I say I am not an expert in the subject, I can show you practical examples of how all that impacts climate change, how it impacts indigenous tribes and populations, and how it impacts our future investments. When I was the environment minister, we struggled against corruption very strongly. And the fact that we developed a plan that led us to a series of measures. One of them was intelligence work to bring down criminal groups and gangs that were stealing public land, destroying all the forests on them, based on corruption, either with false documents or for deforestation or through arson. With this information that we collected, we were able to arrest 725 individuals. We were able to apply 4 billion reais in penalties, and we were able to confiscate millions of cubic meters of timber. We also occupied areas that should be protected, creating 25 million hectares of conservation units, areas that had been illegally occupied, many times with the knowledge and agreement of people in government. There were gangs that were formed for these illegal and corrupt practices. You have 5 minutes. And therefore, we need to break this cycle. And with the work that was carried out, we were able to prevent 4 billion tons of CO2 to be launched to the atmosphere. Well, Brazil was the country that lost the least amount of biodiversity. In our administration, we were responsible for 50% of the protected areas that were created in the planet. Brazil gave the greatest contribution under the Kyoto Protocol to CO2 reductions. And all this is related to measures that were taken to fight corruption that was influencing our government. There is the institutional corruption or a legal corruption, as I believe it was a director of the World Bank who said that. But here in Brazil, former police director Pontes from the federal police calls it institutional corruption. It happens when those who are in power abuse of that power, political power mainly, to create laws to protect criminals. It is the case of the regulation of areas that are invaded criminally, and entire processes are cooked within the Congress to reward those who criminally took over public lands. In my administration, for example, we were able to cancel and prevent over 35,000 illegal properties. And when we say that we reduced deforestation by over 80% along 10 years, avoiding the launching of 4 billion tons of CO2 into our atmosphere during that period, we are saying that corruption was systematically fought against. We did away with corruption during that period because we did not create any form of expectation that criminals would be rewarded or protected by any law that would regulate the crimes they practiced. This benefited the reduction and loss of biodiversity, and also it contributed to the reduced emission of CO2. It contributed to the indigenous population, which had their lands demarcated. When we started in the ministry, for example, there were 5 million hectares for traditional non-indigenous populations, such as the rubber tappers and other ethnic groups. They were 5 million, and during my administration, this area was doubled. So there is a direct relationship between corruption and the complying of commitments established in the Paris Agreement, in the SDGs, in the loss of biodiversity, and so many treaties that we have under the 3 framework conventions on climate and desertification. Corruption directly impacts the social, economic, and environmental sides. And finally, I would say that another form of corruption is the corruption of ideas, using concepts inadequately. We can look at some sustainable development actions and describe them in words, but not in actions. This is a form of corrupting ideas, concepts, and paradigms, because there are things that, as Oscar Cesarotto says, are very strongly prevented in the beginning, but they end up being assimilated and covered by prior ideas that remove the essence of the concept and bring up disguised manners of corrupting these ideas so that they can give continuity to the model that destroys the environment, produces climate insecurity and climate injustice. So corruption exists in several forms, in my view, but the damages it causes are diverse. They touch the legal, the objective, and material aspects, and even everything that we understand and absorb in our relationship with nature, for simply not noticing that in doing that, we are sacrificing the future of future generations. Thank you. Thank you, Minister. Very interesting how you discussed the direct relationship between fighting crime and the international treaties. Now we will have the honor, another honor, of hearing Mr. Klaus Töpfer, who will let me introduce him. He has a PhD in economy. He was a minister for health in Germany and the minister for the environment, for nuclear security. He was a general director of the UN, also served in Nairobi, and also in the UN Environment Program. Today he is a board member of several companies, and you have the floor, Mr. Töpfer.
It's really a great honor for me to be with you, sitting here in Germany, but being invited by the German embassy and knowing that my good old friend Marina Silva is there. It was a must to participate. So thank you very much. As I can inform you, when I was in Brazil in my capacity as Secretary General of the United Nations responsible for the environment, I got a present from Marina Silva. Maybe you can see it. It is on my table all the days. Here we are. Marina, maybe you can remember it. You gave it to me as a farewell present when I left the United Nations. And once more, we admired you and your work, and what you underlined right now proves that we were on the right side. To be speaking on behalf of the United Nations is a very bold decision for myself, because I, as you can easily see it, I'm an old man now. And the time where I was active, it is quite a long time ago. But nevertheless, I believe I have to underline first that these huge problems we are confronted with right now climate change, environment protection, pandemic, all go on, hunger crises in Africa and other parts of the world, and corruption are happening in the same moment. They all need multilateral answers. We are quite now confronted with a huge crisis of multilateralism. The United Nations has a huge problem. You see it in the discussion in the United States of America with regard to the World Health Organization, WHO. You see it with regard to WTO, the trade organization. You need in totally other fields. We are depending in the United Nations on the money coming from some donor countries. There's always the underlying suspicious that there might be the will of the donor countries more important than the overall capacity on the world. So take it all together, it is true that what Peter Hain, a former foreign minister in the UK, once read in a little booklet, The End of Foreign Policy, that more and more things are beyond the capacity of any individual state. If we are discussing corruption, we have to discuss it on a broader level. Yes, the United Nations decided in 2003 to pass the Convention on Corruption. By the way, shame on Germany as well. We finally ratified this convention in 2014, and it was finalized 25. So you see, there are very intensive tensions there. And that we have quite a push on the corruption side now is without any doubt a fact. Why? We are, again, integrated in the national view. America first, Brexit, you can go in Europe, you can go in the world. You are out of the multilateral system and you are only considering what is helpful to yourself. I believe that is one of the parts. And on the other part, we are in the secular situation of fake news. Fake news and corruption are brothers and sisters. Well, fake news is very close to lies. You cannot expect that on these parts, where economic topics are very, very central in the field, and it is, as Marina Silva rightly mentioned, not only an individual problem of some rotten apples, it is a problem of the society, of the cultural integration of society, of corruption in the society itself. And we know that is also stimulated, fired from outside. Therefore, it is a myth that we are now in this crisis of multilateralism. And it would be a great signal also against corruption if Brazil could come back in the family of those being very closely interrelated in the implementation of international law. Yes, the United Nations did a lot with negotiation of conventions, climate change, biodiversity, desertification, corruption, as I mentioned it, World Health Organization, and so on. But the main topic is that we have the common backing for this all over the world, and this is not the fact right now. Therefore, first and foremost, and not only because we are also guests of Transparency International, the first precondition is transparency. And this is a topic for an organization like the United Nations. We are, to some extent, understood as independent advisor. And this independent advisor has to be responsible to make facts and figures available for each and everybody. Very closely linked with education. We have to be integrated in the education, in seminars. We have to do it in broad exchange of young people between the different states, and to give them the feeling that we are sitting together and corruption is one of the poisoning topic for the whole society. And if you want to overcome this poisoning process, you have to bring the young people on board. So I believe that is the first huge topic. Make it transparent, and make it a part of the education of young people, that to be not corrupt and to be very, very nervous if you see something happening like this is clear. Second topic, you know, we have climate change to fight. And what we have to do is to change totally our energy basis, to go out of the fossil fuels, oil, gas, and coal. Until now, the central topic for our energy supply, and we have to change it to renewable energy, solar, wind, and others. We have to change it in one part of the world to nuclear, so that the old industries are fighting extremely to prolongate the process they are needed. It's very easy to understand, and there's a lot of money going for the protection of these old industries. As you see it in other countries, in Nigeria, oil and gas industry is responsible for over 70% of the national budget. In Russia, it's over 40%. In Angola, is again more than 80%. So if you change all this, and you can see it in Brazil to some extent as well, you know that we were admiring the first steps of energy change in Brazil very much in those days, also with your car and the use of petrol in a very specific way. In this very moment, we have to be aware that these pressures for the old structures are extremely high and bring a lot of corruption to the people, even to the people in the overall society, because they are afraid of their jobs, they are afraid of the future they come. And if you are responsible on the global level, you see a country like, or a continent like Africa, where we have in the middle of this century more than 2 billion people living. Young people, they all need jobs and they all need energy and they all need exactly economic development. And if you then come without any alternatives, it is difficult. Therefore, the second topic, make energy technologies available which are globalization, open for globalization, which are decentralized, where the people can participate immediately and directly, where they can change for capital intensive energy to labor intensive part. I think that is my conviction, what I learned in Africa. You cannot develop this continent with nuclear. You can only do it by decentralized, labor intensive, and open for mistakes technologies. These are the conditions I have to fight against corruption, because the people must be responsible for their livelihood themselves and not depending on the big ones. Finally, I think I have to underline that we have to be aware of the interrelation between the gap in the income distribution in a country and corruption. And the gap is growing all over the world. And the gap is growing in Brazil, I believe, as well. And therefore, I believe if you have those powerful groups, I say groups, you can say families or others, they are not only important in one part of the economy, they are important for all the parts in the economy. And they are, of course, those who are also influencing indirectly the way how to handle all this. I believe that, again, this is a global topic. I don't want that a German company is compensating its CO2 emissions in Germany by making afforestation in Brazil. I believe that is an easy way out, and this is a way we are legalizing the other topic as well. So it is also something what we have to be aware, that the corruption in other countries, especially we are discussing here in Brazil, has obligations for the rest of the world, especially for the developed countries. And therefore, I believe it is good that I could contribute a little bit to your discussion, and I want to learn more, even if I am, as I mentioned in the beginning, a very old man. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Muito obrigada. Riquíssima contribuição.
Thank you very much for the wealth of your contribution. We will now go back to the domestic scenario with another honor of listening to the Justice of the Superior Court, Mr. Herman Benjamin, very active in several entities, member of the group that enacted the law against crimes against the environment, also a counselor of CONAMA, the National Environmental Council. Thank you, Minister. You have the floor. I would like to begin by thanking for the invitation, especially to the coordinator of this session, Ana Carolina Amaral, a very respected journalist in our country. I also want to say about the importance of this event organized jointly by the German Embassy and Transparency International. I would like to begin with the obvious, maybe. These two topics in many parts of the world simply cannot be discussed. They are forbidden. And I am not referring only to totalitarian countries or dictatorships. I also refer to other jurisdictions in which both those who are concerned with corruption or with the preservation of the environment do not have the freedom to discuss the two topics openly. Maybe this is one good news for our panel. The second obvious aspect is that the two topics are not interesting only to Brazil. There is a global concern both with the environment and with corruption. Therefore, it is not something that is peculiar only to our country. Corruption and environmental degradation exist in many countries, including extremely developed countries. It all depends on what we consider as environmental degradation and what we consider as corruption, as Minister Marina Silva put it so correctly. The first point that has been laid out for all of us, or maybe only for me, is the connection, on the one hand, between corruption on the one hand and environmental degradation on the other hand. This topic may sound easy and almost obvious, but it is not. And I would like to point out what I call new perceptions. We try to organize our thoughts about these two topics and the marriage between these two topics, as we are doing in this panel through these new perceptions. The first new perception is that although degradation and corruption are with us since ever, and the first documents written in Mesopotamia mention both topics, but not with the same understanding of their severity and of their importance to people's everyday life as we do today. It is correct to say that presently, and this is the first change in perception, we are very clear about the fact that environmental degradation is not only something that is interesting to a small group. Environmental degradation impacts the essence of life. And the same applies to corruption. It is not a minor fact in the life of populations. The perception we have today is that corruption impacts the very fundamental of democracy. So we have degradation impacting the fundamentals of life, and corruption impacting the fundamentals of democracy and of the rule of law, as I will explain in a short time. Now let us see the second aspect of this changed perception. Until quite recently, both corruption and environmental degradation were seen as local phenomena, or maybe national phenomena. Many times they were attributed to tribal relations, to nepotism, to blood relations, or to marriage, but nothing beyond the national borders. And today, this perception has been changed. On the one hand, we see degradation and corruption as global phenomena, that is, they involve global players and also global victims. And on the other hand, we see degradation and corruption as an international phenomenon, as Mr. Klaus Töpfer said himself, an international phenomenon that calls the attention of international entities, especially the United Nations and the UN Environment Program, which he directed. The third change in perception has to do with the role of the law. And here I feel myself under pressure between a historian, an economist, and an expert in international relationships. So I will keep myself only to the legal focus. In the past, and not a very remote past, only 40 years ago, we imagined that the problem with degradation was the lack of laws, the lack of a legal framework, a global one, that since the Stockholm Conference in 1972 began to be assumed or filled in. And in Brazil, we had the same perception that we lacked the laws. Laws have been passed both internationally with all their difficulties and weaknesses through treaties and conventions, but they are stronger in protecting the environmental degradation than corruption. But from then on, we discovered, and very importantly in Brazil, because we do have different characteristics from other countries, not only Brazil, but Latin America, we discovered that laws were not sufficient, that to fight corruption and to fight environmental degradation, as important as laws was their enforcement. The expression enforcement of laws was not even used in law schools when I was a student. The concept of enforcement was totally far away from our reality. Brazilians did not even have a word for enforcement in Portuguese, so much so that when we are talking among experts, we use the word enforcement in English, because we have a legal culture in which the law is the most important thing. And when it comes to property laws or contracts, the parties seek the enforcement of their rights and obligations. But we know that this formula, property law and contract, does not work for environmental degradation, and it also does not work for corruption. So this third perception in which we, especially Brazilians, understand that it is not sufficient to have the law, but you need to have laws enforced. They need to be applied. Now, I will describe the fourth change in perception. And here, this has already been said by Minister Marina Silva and also by Mr. Töpfer. You have 5 minutes. Here we have another change, which is that until recently, 20, 30 years ago, or 40 years in other countries, 20 years in Brazil, environmental aspects and corruption were seen as topics for the ghetto, for hippies, and they tried to diminish the agenda, saying that it was something for dreamers, the hippies, as they were called. And regarding corruption, they were called the purists. And we know very well that today these two topics are included in our domestic agenda, in people's concerns. And they not only make up a national feeling, but also a global feeling that they are topics that are interesting to the whole world. And I will conclude my thoughts. And with regards to these changes in perception, with a fifth change in perception, which was also mentioned by Minister Silva. Specifically, what is environmental degradation and corruption? This is a deeper change, a conceptual one. In terms of environmental degradation, we began to see environmental degradation in areas that were considered absolutely natural. Deforestate property, leaving it without any branch, as we call it, is part of a conception of property that is no longer supported, not only culturally, but also in our Constitution and in our laws. Corruption also was seen almost as a national entertainment, something natural, that somebody is elected and even a judge will receive bribes. These are the strongest cases of corruption or of degradation, but we have a different perception. Now we understand that being corrupt is not only taking cash from the public treasure. Being corrupt today is seen as disrespecting the law, as a public manager whose duty it is to respect the law. To be corrupt is to create laws to your own gain, or that of your friends, or that of those who contribute to your political campaigns. Being corrupt is not seeing the importance of in the Federal Constitution of 1988 to the protection of the environment and of the public treasures that what the Constitution calls administrative property. This is much broader than corruption. My last words in my last minute will be about the risks of a legislative step back. Initially, we required laws. The laws were passed along the years since 1981 with the environmental legislation and then with the administrative property or properness law that was passed in 1982, exactly when we gathered. Mr. Töpfer was there and Mrs. Silva was also there in June 1992. So this was a temporal connection between the two agendas, the environmental agenda, the international agenda, and also fighting against corruption with the administrative responsibility law. Right now, these two legislative agendas are being discussed in the Brazilian Congress and running the risk of stepbacks, both in the fight against corruption as in the fight against environmental degradation. And this is the paradox in our country. We have progressed so much in terms of legislation, and then 30 years later, we are concerned with possible setbacks in our laws. So I will conclude my ideas. There are also other aspects, but I'm sure we will discuss them. Thank you, Minister, for your excellent contribution, the evolution of the perceptions. We discuss so many setbacks, and we are almost having the Rio Plus 30 conference 2 years from now. And with all this evolution, we saw a change in perception recently in Germany with their perception and their reaction to the trade agreement between the European Union and the Mercosur. The country is very worried with environmental degradation. We already have questions coming in about this, but I will let you make your own connections between these topics and the risks that one agenda implies to the other. And of course, we will develop and discuss trade relations during our dialogue. Anna Cavazzini is a member of the European Parliament. She is part of the International Trade Committee and also the Internal Consumer Protection Committee. She is a vice president for the European Union of Relations with Brazil and also member of the Euro-Latin American Commission. Thank you, Ms. Cavazzini. You have the floor.
Hello, and thank you for the invitation. Introduction. Now I hear myself. Probably have to mute the translation. Let me. Okay, so I hope it works. Yeah, perfect. So I had an echo and I heard myself, but I think now it's working. I think it is amazing that we have a dialogue that goes via the Atlantic, especially in those times where it's probably not so easy with the Brazilian government. And I think it's amazing that you picked the topic environment and corruption, because I think it's not very often discussed jointly, but it's, as we heard already by the excellent speakers today, it's a very, very important topic to fight corruption when we really want to achieve the SDGs and the climate goals of Paris. I think very often, and we heard this in the inputs already, that environmental degradation and exploitation of resources are very much linked to corruption. Of course, I mean, the goal in mind of a lot of people who do that is to circumvent the legislation and then export, often very export export the resources that are being extracted. So this is why I think it is important to also talk about the trade link, because we in Europe, we have a lot of environmental corruption as well. I mean, we also have problems with logging, illegal logging, for example, in Romania or in Bulgaria. And the people are also going on the street and fighting that because they are really fed up with the governments not controlling that. So it's not only whatever Brazilian or whatever problem, it's also a European problem. So we have the internal dimension in Europe, but also we have the import dimension, because I think often when natural resources are being exploited, when corruption is happening, those products at the end, they land on the European market. And then, of course, the big question is what the European Union can do in order to prevent those products coming on the market, or prevent incentivizing environmental corruption in other countries. And I think there is already a lot of interesting voluntary initiatives, for example, when it comes to soy and deforestation. But we also can see, and a lot of research has shown, that voluntary initiatives do not always work. It really depends on how they're designed and how they're set up, how the enforcement and control mechanisms work. And I would always say, at the end, legislation or rules is better than only voluntary initiatives, because then it also gives a lot of clarity and certainty. So the European Union was very active in the last couple of years in fighting, or at least trying to tackle the problem of, let's say, imported environmental corruption. And some things work better than others. Let's put it like this. For example, as you probably all know, there's the accounting directive. So in the year 2013, the European Union really tried to all the companies that are active in logging and extractive industries to publish what they pay to governments in order to increase transparency and also in order to decrease corruption. And I think this is a very interesting piece of legislation and a big step forward. As you probably also know, there is the FLEGT initiative by the European Union. It's like the Forest Law Enforcement, Governance and Trade Action Plan. And the European Union has, with a lot of countries in the world, so-called voluntary partnership agreements in order to try to improve forest management and to decrease illegal logging. It's not existing with Brazil, but with a lot of other countries in the world. But here we see that enforcement is lagging. I think this instrument can still be improved. It's not working perfectly. And then we also have the timber regulation. And this is a very, I would say, stronger instrument. It's not only voluntary, it is really trying to forbid timber from illegal logging to enter the European market. And I think this is a very interesting model that we can build on for future regulation. And at the moment in the European Parliament and in the Commission, we are discussing even further initiative to prevent imported environmental corruption. And both initiatives are very, very interesting. Today or tomorrow here in the European Parliament, and just right now in Brussels, we're going to vote on a legislative report in the European Parliament that will propose due diligence in the forest sector in order to prevent illegal deforestation. So the idea is that especially when we look at the high-risk commodities like soy or like beef or palm oil, that products which are linked with illegal deforestation cannot enter the European market anymore. And I think this will, of course, increase, hopefully, also the enforcement in those countries where we import the products from. And then we are also discussing at the European Parliament level, but also the Commission has already announced a proposal, a legislative proposal for next year, a horizontal due diligence legislation that will basically oblige all the companies active in the European market to comply with the basic human rights and also environmental rights throughout their supply chains. And this, of course, includes also good governance and fighting against corruption. So we have, I think, at the moment, two very interesting pieces of legislation being negotiated in the European Parliament and also in the Commission, of course, that really tries to tackle this problem we are addressing today. You mentioned at the beginning also the Mercosur trade agreement, and you had also asked me in advance to consider the question or to discuss the question if this Mercosur agreement would at the end help or worsen the situation. And it's a very valuable question because in this trade agreement, of course, you have interesting parts on sustainability, for example, commitments against deforestation or commitments to fulfill the Paris Agreement, fulfill provisions to fulfill core labor rights, human rights, and so on the one hand. But on the other hand, the problem I see with this agreement is that you incentivize the exports of these forest risk commodities because there will be new quotas or increased quotas. So the export of these agricultural commodities will increase, while at the same time you don't have an enforcement mechanism in the agreement. There's a lot of good words on deforestation, on human rights, but the implementation mechanism is very, very weak. There is only basically an expert panel that can write a report at the end. So this is our huge criticism, that I think the agreement will worsen the situation, will worsen the pressure on the Amazonas, for example, or on the Cerrado, or on the areas that are endangered anyhow, while on the other hand not having a good enforcement mechanism. And that's why also we in the European Parliament voted against the Mercosur agreement 2 weeks ago. It's a non-binding vote, but it's a political resolution that shows that the Parliament is very concerned with the current dismantling of environmental protection in Brazil. And so to conclude this part, I think a trade agreement could help. A trade agreement, if it's well designed, it could increase also the tools against fighting imported corruption. But as this agreement is designed at the moment, I think it's rather worsening the situation than improving the situation. And with this short overview, I can stop here, and I'm looking forward to the discussion, because I think probably also not everything that I said is uncontroversial, and I'm looking forward to discussing with you.
Excellent, thank you. Muito obrigada.
Thank you very much. I am curious to see what would be the possibilities of designing something that would really help to protect the environment. We are going on to the questions now, and our public is welcome to submit questions through the chat box. In this first round, we will ask questions that we have prepared ourselves, and I will try to add some questions that I myself prepared. I will begin with Minister Herman Benjamin. What are the main obstacles in the judiciary branch today concerning corruption and other environmental crimes? And I would like to know, Minister, what is your assessment of the judiciary branch now in a context when they have been making several decisions about environmental laws, as the Minister of the Environment himself said, to open the fence for the cattle to... How do you assess the behavior, the conduct of our judiciary? Ana Carolina, I will answer the first part of the question, but not the second. As a justice, I cannot comment on the conduct of the government and its ministers, and certainly the other speakers will be better prepared and will be able to touch upon these aspects more openly. I am here to provide a legal scenario and support. No, just to understand the role of the judiciary in the democracy. Okay, so for those who do not know the Brazilian judiciary branch, we are an institution which is entirely based on merit. Nobody becomes a judge or a justice in Brazil except for our constitutional court and 1/5 of my own court, the Superior Court. Nobody becomes a judge in Brazil without taking an exam, which is one of the most difficult ones in the country, if not the most difficult. And Brazilian judges are among the ones with the best salaries in the world. That not only helps to bring the best professionals, but also to maintain them in the judiciary branch. Now, this is different in other countries. If you know a 24-year-old judge that has newly become a judge, if you come back in 30 years, you will find the same judge, most probably in a superior court or in the Supreme Court, which is the constitutional court. And judges depend on the law. That is why I made the observation that after 30 years of the administrative responsibility law, it is strange to discuss the possibility of reducing or taking away that legislative framework, or even with regards to environmental protection. Another difficulty, and technology has been helping with this, especially in the Amazon region, is that many times, especially referring to deforestation, these problems happen in very remote areas, creating a series of difficulties. Of course, today with satellites, since Minister Marina Silva, they began to be used by the judiciary branch, satellite images. And there was an appeal against using satellite images, but the judiciary decided that they could be used. And in Brazil, as in Germany, we cannot invent laws. We must abide by our constitution and our laws. And in this, Brazil and Germany are very similar. The law is so important for both Brazil and Germany. And I know that this event has been co-organized by the German embassy. Let us remember that until 1998, bribes paid by German companies to government employees of different countries were tax deductible. It was necessary to change the law. Therefore, we must understand, and I give an example from France, it was the same. We must understand that the need to permanently enhance our laws must always look to the front and never to the back or to the past. There must never be setbacks. I will also give other examples of corruption in the environmental area in Brazil that led to changes in legislation, such as the case of bribes paid by German companies. Thank you, Minister. So in the next round, I will reword and rephrase my question. Minister Marina Silva, could you remind us of instruments that were successful in the past? Do you think that any of them could still be used in the present to reduce the rate of deforestation? And also, how do you see the setbacks in corruption as well as in environmental policies? Your microphone, please, Minister. I have no doubt that a series of measures that were adopted and that were successful were gradually abandoned because these measures, they were successful and they began to be abandoned in 2012 when deforestation began to grow again. Not as much as it happens today, because there was a weakening, but now these measures have been totally abandoned and destroyed. One very successful measure was about transparency. Transparency is essential because besides the mechanisms for enforcing law, when criminals and corrupt people know that they will not be criminalized, there is also the fact that they do not count with the possibility of invisibility of their offense. And this helps in penalizing. When we created a series of measures, one of them created a system for real-time deforestation monitoring. And I remember that at that time, there were two discussions. One was that we had a monitoring system that provided precise information about how much was deforested that year. But that happened after the fact. There was nothing to be done. The problem was already existing. So the first thing I did was ask the technicians at Brazilian's INPE if we could do that identification in real time. They said it was a possibility. So in face of that, my decision was to make all the data available to the press, to experts inside and outside of Brazil. This led to a major discussion in Brazil. They said there would be a major embarrassment because the Amazon was a black box of problems, and it was a matter of hiding problems, putting them away so that they were not seen. And I wanted to give visibility and transparency to them. And one of the arguments I used to make this decision is that when somebody said, we will be embarrassed all the time, and I answered, yes, I want us to be embarrassed because people need to know about this. The scientific community, society, the media need to know that you cannot destroy 700 hectares of virgin forest because you need to buy gasoline or bribes or tickets for the government employees. And transparency helps to fight against corruption. It helps. Transparency is also a process of inhibition because offenders, many times, they steal public land, public money, and they go over and make those very long speeches against corruption. So when you have transparency, this helps. And so in 2012, this began to be abandoned, and it can be recovered and helped. On the other hand, you have offenders, criminals who need to be penalized and not rewarded. We have such practices. We should publish a list of all the public offenders, and that really works. We cannot create laws to legalize crimes, because if you steal from the country and then you have a law approved by Congress to legalize that land, it's as if you smuggled guns and then you receive the permit to use and to hold the gun. So things like that were made, and there are a series of measures that fight against corruption, against environmental degradation. They help to meet our goals, both in mitigation and in other agendas, because the resources are visible. When we inhibit 86 clandestine lands, this was a form of fighting against corruption. Thank you, Ms. Silva. Now I will pull the topic of transparency, and we had heard it before. So how is environmental transparency, such as that given by the Argos Treaty in Europe and others, how can they contribute? What were the lessons learned from the Argos Agreement in Europe, and how can we adapt this in Latin America? Also, using what Justice Benjamin mentioned, if you, Mr. Töpfer, could discuss what happened in Germany since the 1990s regarding his comments. So I give the floor to Klaus Töpfer.
Thank you very much. First and foremost, I have to underline, I'm not sitting here as a representative of the German government, and I'm not sitting here to defend the situation in Germany. That's not my intention. I was invited to represent the United Nations position in this field. That we have a lot of problems at home, that's true. And that you can also mention, Mr. Benjamin, that we used all the fossil fuels for our economic development in the past is true as well. So you can blame us for being responsible for the situation of the climate problem. All this is to look back and to say you was a sinner as well, and you are a sinner. But this was not my conviction. I can only underline that for the time being, we are trying not to teach, but to explain why we're doing something. I don't want to be a teacher as well. That's not my style, to say it very easily. And if you see that we try to go out of the CO2 emission energy supply, it costs us, of course, a lot of money. And you can say, but you have the money, right? So, and we want to invest it in this, it's also okay. We have now nearly 50% of our electricity production coming from renewable energies. And we sincerely hope that we really can realize what was done in the Paris Agreement without any decrease of the ambition targets being free of CO2 in 2015. I also want to underline that this has to do a lot with our trade relations. Yes, Germany is quite an important exporter country. I think we were number 1 or 2. The Chinese are now better than we are, but there are some people more than we are. So if you say per capita, we are still quite active in exports. So we are not the white people making no mistakes. Yes, we are making mistakes as well. And we try in the discussion also with countries like Brazil, a very important, a wonderful country, to do it in a very cooperative and in a very friendly way. And thank you very much for giving us this advice as well. For to accept the negative consequence of lower energy prices in the past. And these are the handling of waste. Very difficult. The first precondition for transparency is that those who are sending the information must have confidence, must have trust. to regain trust for politics, we have to make those information concerning the underground situation of those places where we are trying to make a final deposit for nuclear waste transparent. Having in mind that there are private interests and the private interests are protected, it was a huge, huge fight with regard to what must be publicly known and what is the obligation to inform the people. And this is linked with the Aarhus Convention, without any doubt, and with the European law, of course. I only want to underline this, and you can, of course, see it as well in the European Union, because other countries have comparable topics. So the Aarhus Convention is extremely important. In my experience, being headquartered for 8 years in Nairobi in Kenya, the question was not to make the information for the underground aware. The information are not known. We don't have the same dense structure of information. So one contribution to more transparency is to invest in information gaining, but I have no other ideas. But that might be the same if you ask the people in S.Paulo, what's the Aarhus Convention? You will also not have a broad. In S.Paulo, what's the Aarhus Convention? You will also not have a broad knowledge about this, but it is very important to have those topics, as it is important to have Paris Agreement, as it is important to have the biodiversity and the situation of the protection of the knowledge base, as Marina Silva mentioned it before, the ideas, the patents, and so on. All this is linked with corruption, is linked with information, is linked with transparency. Therefore, underlined it 3 times, because it is poisoning the credibility of a government in the broader society if you are not credible in the information you give to the people. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It's very hard, this job of interrupting such important contribution.
We now have the perfect opportunity to go back to the Mercosur trade agreement. I thought it was very interesting how our Ms. Cavazzini showed the possibility of design an agreement and not simply vetoing it, or rather to have an agreement that is designed to encourage legal and fair processes. There is a law that is up for vote in the UK government to ensure that all imports into the country are of legal origin. I would like to hear from you about this vote that will happen today or tomorrow in the European Parliament, and what do you think of the agreement that is designed to favor in the environment and not to threaten it?
Yeah, thank you so much. I mean, I try to, I have to also again, sorry, switch off my interpretation because otherwise, okay. I tried to explain in my first initial statement that this legislation that we are voting, it's an own legislative initiative report, so it will ask the Commission to come forward with the legislation, will really, to my mind, be a game changer in global economic policies. And I think it's a very, very good development. It is also really a long-standing work of my group, the Greens, of civil society. For example, organizations like Greenpeace have pushed for that for years, because yeah, we are seeing that our imports, our consumption also in Europe is very much linked to environmental degradation in other countries. And I think it is not fair, but it's also contrary to reaching our goals, the SDGs and the Paris Agreement. So if the report is voted, it will mean that companies have to make sure that all the products they import, for example, soy or palm oil or whatever, is not increasing deforestation in third countries. And I think, yeah, this is really amazing. It is very much linked to what Mr. Töpfer said, the legislation that we're also discussing on German level, like the Lieferkettengesetz, supply chain law. And we will hopefully have some steps forward on this in Germany, but also have such a horizontal legislation at some point in Europe next year. So a very commodity-specific instrument on deforestation, but then also a horizontal legislation that covers all areas and not only deforestation. And I think this is, yeah, as I said, a big, I think, leverage in order to not only rely on reporting or on voluntary or on transparency, which is all very, very important, but it will give hopefully also the levy for liability and remedy. So if companies violate this law, there will be also at the end sanctions or like liability or like penalties. And I think what Marina Silva explained, I find fascinating, because you really see the difference between policy making. Policy making can make a change at the end. If you have good policies in place, if you have enforcement mechanism in place, if you have enough money that go to the enforcement authorities, then we can protect the forest as one example of environmental protection. There's other examples. But if you have bad policies in place, or if you dismantle everything like what is happening at the moment in Brazil, then you have the really adverse effect. And I think this shows again for me, it matters so much what kind of policies we are putting in place. It shows that we can change something. I think this is the good news. We can stop environmental degradation. We can stop deforestation if we only want to, but we need to have the right rules in place. And I can only finish with saying that at the European level, there is so much more happening on the environment in the last 2 years, because people get really aware that climate change is a huge problem. It's around for 20, 30 years, but now I think the awareness is really there amongst a lot of people. That has also to do with the fact that the Fridays for Future movement was very, very active. I think there's a lot of awareness of what's happening in Brazil. You might find it interesting, but like, if I go to my constituency, that is Eastern Germany, yeah, it's like Saxony, it's a small state in Eastern Germany, and I speak in little villages about the Mercosur agreement and then how our trade policy is linked to the destruction of the Amazon. Everyone knows about it, and it's not a colonial thing. Oh my God, Brazil is destroying everything where we can do what we want. No, it's more like a solidarity feeling I'm getting. Like, people really think, wow, the Amazon is so precious. There is also so many people in Brazil fighting for keeping the Amazon, but there is also our consumption that destroys it with the soy that we feed to our animals, that creates very bad environmental impact in Europe with too many mass production of animals. So I think people are getting more and more conscious, and this is a good thing. And this is why also we're having a lot of policy changes at the moment, because we are getting the pressure from the street, and this is good.
Thank you. Obrigada.
I would like to give the floor to Minister Marina Silva. A question from Chats Geld. He says, I live in São Paulo in the ABC region, city of Santo André, that is being sold to install a dry dock or a dry port. What do you think of this? Why do the mayors allow so much destruction? The question is to all of our participants, but I ask the minister first because there is a very special relationship with the local population, and I'd like you to discuss that because these crimes also affect the local population. We talk about the Amazon, where there are many Black people. Many people may not know of that. And so how can fighting against these crimes impact local populations? And what is the local perception of these criminal activities such as squatting, illegal lands, and deforestation? Your microphone, please, Minister. I always forget it. Well, first of all, to talk about the project in the question, what I can tell you in general terms is that any project needs to be dealt with according to the new conception of the current licensing processes. You can no longer consider that social and environmental problems that are brought up by the impacts of a specific project are only externalities. The government considers them as externalities, but there is no such thing as externalities. They will always impact somebody. So when I was the Minister of the Environment, what we did, and I believe that this is a project that requires local or state licensing, but in my time, we had a rule. A project must be feasible, but not only economically feasible. It must be feasible socially, environmentally, and also culturally in many times, because when you are impacting an indigenous land with your cultural values, the project will not meet all the requirements to obtain a license. And this happened in my time with the Belo Monte energy plant, for example. I had it subjected to more studies because there was no environmental benefits, and therefore we also prevented a license from another plant that was being delayed for 12 years because nobody was brave enough to say that there was no technical benefits from that project. So the competent entities must pay close attention, not only with regards to the economic returns or aspects, but also with the social aspects, because that was a very important area, a water basin, very important because it feeds into reservoirs and other water supply systems. So it would not be worth the investment because there would be major damage to nature. And therefore, my position is that such a project needs to prove its feasibility in the 3 levels. And since this impacts communities in general, which was your specific question, well, depending on the region, the impact on the community may be terrible. Many times it may mean death. It means you have to abandon your home, or you get sick from mercury poisoning, or many times you are treated as those who are putting an obstacle for future progress of the country. And this is all manipulated so that people feel that that small community is harassing you when they're actually helping you. In the case of the National Park of Xingu, the indigenous communities that were discriminated for so long, the municipalities or cities around the park are benefited. because the presence of the forest gives them 2 rainy seasons, and with that the farmers can have 2 crops a year, and that helps them because of the indigenous lands forest. I even think that there should be an agreement between these grain farmers that have 2 crops a year thanks to the indigenous lands. Maybe they could create a fund to reward indigenous people for their work in protecting these farmers' lands. So this would be perfectly reasonable and ethical and feasible, because the farmers are benefited by the Xingu forest. So it's so interesting when you look at it in more practical terms. So the desire is that all communities be impacted positively and not negatively. Thank you very much, Marina. It is a very local perception. We have a question from Lara Beatriz Kochevisky, and it is an open question for whoever wishes to answer. She says, the financial market has been incorporating climate risk in their decisions. What is the weight of this in the sense of having more ecological positions? If anybody would like to answer that. If not, I will add a second question, which I can believe can go to Mr. Töpfer. What is the importance of approaching corruption and fraud risks to deal and approach the international treaties for emissions, such as the Paris Agreement? Mr. Töpfer.
Only to add some words to the role of the communities. I believe we are now confronted in the pandemic of Corona that the local communities are more and more important in their decisions. And what we are witnessing is something like a renaissance of regionalization. So we are going back to the smaller units. And I believe that is very helpful, by the way, and we should stick to this. And I believe it will not go as soon as the pandemic of Corona is, let me say, handled. I'm very carefully saying like this. The second, the central wording is enforcement. You know, we have wonderful conventions, no doubt. I mentioned always some of those. I mentioned it as the Aarhus Convention. You have a wonderful convention, but you need the investment to have the information, to give them to the people. And therefore, we are very, very interested in the question of enforcement of law on the international level as well. This is, I believe, also important with regard to the more specific convention on corruption or on the export and import of hazardous waste and others, where we need urgently the enforcement capacity increasing. I see it in the health situation as well. So I'm a little bit afraid that the mentioned crisis of multilateralism at the very beginning is also linked with the crisis of enforcement of the existing legal structures in the UN system. And therefore, I'm very sure that it is good to have a decentralization and to have this renaissance of regional activities. I see it very clearly, as I mentioned, also in climate change. The cities are in power, directly working with the people together. They are directly elected by the people. They have much more chances to integrate the people. So they have not only the representative democracy, but also the democracy of the people directly again. So to mix these topics, that will be a perspective for democracy altogether, I believe, that we bring much more direct contribution of people in the political framework. And this is better in cities and in a regional context and easier there. We have to prove it there as a matter of solving problems. I believe that is very, very helpful, and therefore I'm happy that you mentioned this topic and the question was mentioning this. What's going on the local level? Before the local level is on the top of a government, you need a long time, but the local level is directly there. And they make the
One
people
last minute.
responsible for this. And therefore, I'm 100% convinced it's the same as with the international laws we passed. They are good, they can be better, of course, they are always a result of compromises. If you have 194 national interests, you must make compromises, that's no doubt. But they are fairly good if you could really realize them. Therefore, we need more enforcement capacity there on the global level or the national level. The sentence is true that the national governments are too small for the big things and too big for the small things. I believe that what Benjamin Barber and other thinkers mentioned, what would happen if mayors ruled the world, would be quite an interesting topic, but this goes beyond what we are discussing today. Therefore, I want only to mention it, that this decentralized structure is the center of my interest as well here in this country. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Vou direcionar uma.
I will now ask a last question for Minister Herman Benjamin, and then we will have final minutes for each one to make their conclusion comments. We need to end at 1 o'clock sharp. Minister, we have gathered 2 questions and we hope to hear from you. How is corruption in politics, the illegal funding of campaigns, how can this impact the formulation of environmental public policies? And on the other hand, how do instruments against corruption help in fighting against environmental crimes? And if you allow me, I would like to go back to my other question. I was not asking you exactly about the political scenario, but your views on the judiciary branch, which in Brazil has been more and more called upon. There was a problem recently with CONAMA that you had reported on since 2016 about Resolution 203. And of course, there were private interests involved in deregulating that resolution. Thank you. I would like to begin by saying that the way I see the evolution of law in our country is not by copying bad examples or negative examples that come from other countries. I believe we need to examine the best practices of judicial enforcement and lawmaking. So if a specific country became rich by deforesting their own forests, this is an example that I do not want to follow, and I don't need to follow it, because the Brazilian Constitution has very clear rules that are enforced upon us. And therefore, there is no justification for our wrongdoings by showing other examples. And the same goes for corruption. If other countries are more corrupt than Brazil, or countries that are not corrupt, which are in the top ranks of Transparency International, such as the Scandinavian countries, but they did have corruption in the past, and this is not interesting for Brazil. What is interesting for Brazil is to understand that environmental degradation and corruption are prohibited by our constitution. This is what is important. The second aspect is the insistence on the enforcement. Brazil, Ana Carolina, has a very strange relationship with law enforcement. We love laws that are poetic, that are on paper, but when they begin to be implemented or enforced, if they touch upon powerful economic interests, they become bad laws. They are outdated and they need to be changed. So this is a cultural phenomenon in Brazil that must be changed. We cannot accept laws simply as empty promises that are on the books and that are not to be complied with, or that they must be obeyed only by our political oppositioners or by the vulnerable populations. I know that you, as a journalist, are very much into what is going on. There was an article published in 1961, and it's called De Jeito: Brazil's Institutional Bypass of the Formal Legal System and its Development Implications. This was published in 1971 by analyst to analyze this other problem in Brazil. So first of all, the law was not made to be enforced, but if eventually it is enforced, we will use the Brazilian jeitinho, or the Brazilian way, to get things done in order to distort the law and adapt it to our favor. And that's where corruption comes in. So I'm very much concerned with the topic of enforcement, and also to ensuring that everything that we have obtained in terms of legislative progress. And I will conclude by going back to something I mentioned in the beginning of this panel. Today, besides the crimes against the environment, we have Article 69A that was added or amended as a response to a major hydro plant that was built not in the Amazon region, but in the south of Brazil. It is called the Barra Grande hydro plant. And the environmental impact study did not see that there were 4,000 kilometers of pine tree forests. So today, we have only 8% of Brazilians' Mata Atlântica, the coastal forest, and of pine forest, we have practically none left. So the environmental impact study simply ignored these forests, and the hydro plant was built. At the time, I was not a judge, and I helped in the parliament, and there was an introduction of this instrument, turning things like that into a crime. And it is exactly this instrument that is being discussed in Congress about the new law for environmental licensing. So the law will eliminate this instrument. So we have a doctor that is being sued because he made a mistake with his patient, or you have an architect or an engineer is criminalized for making mistakes. But it is not a crime to make mistakes for the environment. And I complain about that because as a Brazilian judge, we do not make the laws, but we obey and abide by the laws. Yes, very important to bring up this case of omitting or of legalizing an omission. We will now give 1 minute for each of you for your final remarks, beginning with Ms. Cavazzini. We have 2 questions about the trade agreement. They ask why the European Union does not simply prohibit the import of wood from Latin America. They are concerned with more strict measures or maybe a boycott, something in that relation, or especially linked to timber. But I would also like you to give us a perspective, reminding that this is a dialogue and that we're here to think about the post-pandemic world and what are the perspectives for environmental crimes or degradation and corruption are not encouraged, or rather that they are mitigated. Thank you. So each one will have 1 minute.
To very briefly summarize and have a final statement, I want to say that in general, I think cooperation is key. International cooperation is key. And Mr. Töpfer also mentioned this at the beginning. I have the feeling it is at the moment not so easy to cooperate with the Brazilian government, but the more it is important to cooperate with other stakeholders, civil society, or also the governments of the states, for example, on sub-federal level, in order to have cooperation on these very important issues, and the question of how to implement the international treaties that all the countries signed up for, and this is crucial. There is indeed a boycott debate in Europe. It has to do with the feeling that with cooperation we don't come further at the moment, because there is kind of a death wall, or the current Brazilian government is just continuing its destructive environmental policy. And then I think a lot of, even like supermarkets and companies, more and more private investors even, are discussing a boycott. And I think this always can only be the matter of last resort, because it will always harm people. It's always harming cooperation. But of course, it has to do with the fact that I think a lot of people feel a little bit helpless because the current government is not changing its course. But to finish on a more positive note, I'm in kind of almost daily contact with Brazilian stakeholders, and I have the feeling that on the not governmental but below level, there is a lot of cooperation and a very good, excellent idea of what we can reach together, and we should continue this.
Thank you. Now, Mr. Klaus Töpfer, you have 1 minute for your perspectives.
Thank you very much. A very, very good minute. Only to say it was great to learn. And I thank my compatriots on the other side that I could be a partner in this discussion, in this learning lesson. Thank you very much for this. This topic is a very broad one. We didn't cover everything. We didn't cover money laundering, for example. We didn't cover the overall structure of how we can make resources available for fighting corruption. All this is a topic to do in the future as well. And I learned again that I have quite a number of good old friends in Brazil, but it is high time to come back and maybe to have a cup of coffee with Marina Silva in Brazil. And then we can go on in discussing our common intensive interest in the global economy on the basis of national activities linked with local communities and the people all together. We have not mentioned enough the NGOs, we have not mentioned enough what the people on the ground are expecting from politics and how we can restore confidence all over the world, not in only one country, but in all countries in the situation where the democracy is under huge pressure and where we have to do our utmost to solve those problems in the basis as well. Thank you very much and have a good time. Please don't make a mistake with regard to Corona. Be healthy.
Thank you very much, sir. I hope I have an opportunity also to interview with you with more time about all the issues that we did not cover here. Justice Benjamin, please. I believe that this panel has shown us the importance of facing these two topics jointly, as Renato Morgado said so well in the beginning. And in the area of law, this is already being done. Until 3 or 4 years ago, we had the two different tribes, the environmental tribe and the tribe of those who work on the subject of corruption. In the environmental side, we have already brought the two topics together under a concept we call the environmental rule of law. That is, it is not sufficient to have only a rule of law that cares of citizens' basic needs, the more primitive needs and those that are required for their participation. But we have to take care of the fundamentals of life because this is part of the rule of law. And therefore, the environmental assembly at the UN Environment Program accepted this in their legal area. So in conclusion, I believe that that is the way to go. And regarding our country, I am optimistic. Brazil, until 1980, considered deforestation of its natural resources and forests as something good for the country because it would be for the future of mankind. And today we understand that all these topics are not only related to protecting the forest, but also the ecological services provided by the forest. And it is a matter of national security. And it obviously impacts climate change. And then we have the very serious issue of climate immigrants and also justice towards murders that happen in Latin America and also around the world, murders of those who defend the environment and who want to fight against corruption. So Brazil has a very robust set of laws. We need to improve and enhance them and avoid its corrosion or weakness. Thank you very much, Minister Marina Silva. First of all, I would like to thank you for the opportunity of participating in such a relevant and qualified debate as we had here. It is a joy to meet friends and partners such as Mr. Klaus Töpfer because he is a reference for all of us in this struggle. His consistent work, his commitment, his competence in the area of justice, also Minister Herman Benjamin, and also Anna from the European Parliament, who is concerned with how this can be translated in practice, the commercial relationships between our countries. What I want to say is that it is very important to have these efforts thinking about the enforcement. I suffered a lot to understand how we could enforce the law in practice, to say that the national environmental system will work, that the conservation areas will work, and then you have to deal with the great pressure, exactly as Justice Benjamin said. He says the law is very beautiful on paper, but it is not to be practiced. and I refuse to discuss the empty consensus that is being formed. People agree to things on theory, but not in practice. We need to strengthen the enforcement of the system. It means that I need to have the budget, I need to have the human resources, I need to have a strong commitment to have public policies that can be verified. I used to work with a management account, for example. Each one of the areas had a management agreement within the Ministry of the Environment in my time. So water quality, air quality, etc., so that we could have the metrics, so that we could have the system having its own capillarity and reaching out into the states and local governments, and also the important entities, IBAMA, CMBio, the federal police, the state prosecutor, federal prosecutors, which prevent government members to do things that are against the law or simply hide information. So we used to call not only the federal prosecutor, but we did that. And also international treaties and conventions. They need to be translated not only in the commitments that each state or country will take on, but also they need to explain how the grain I will use or the meat I will eat, that there are so many wild birds that are endangered because they are used for beef production. Imagine a 35-meter tall tree that is felled or cut down by the dozens to produce 1 kilogram of beef. We must think about that before we eat. So agreements and treaties must be implemented around this. And then I would like to end by following the Justice Herman's optimism. I believe that by now I simply cannot be optimistic anymore, but not a pessimistic even. I believe in persistence. I think that only with persistence we will be able to deal with the setbacks that are already happening and reposition ourselves. Because if Brazil persists and insists in this local or global governance, it will not be a problem. When I was a minister, agribusiness was growing, deforestation was reducing, and now we have a situation in which our country is facing economic hardships, but we cannot attract investments because we are no longer part of the solution. We are a major problem. Brazil has done good before. Brazil knows how to do things properly. It's just a matter of ethical commitment because the technical solutions are already there. Thank you very much, Minister. Thank you very much to our participants. Besides the honor of hearing you, it was a big comfort to hear your comments, reminding us of optimism, of persistence, and we also had information about bilateral relations, about international treaties and conventions, about the climate and biodiversity based on the UN conventions. Thank you very much for this rich contributions. This is a series of dialogues, so to our public, if you are connected to our series, you will probably be informed of the next editions. So thank you very much. And